Evening. I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us. We're here for our third installment of the Eddie Gabriel educational series. And I just want to say thank you for everyone for tuning in tonight, because there's plenty other things you could be doing, but you chose to tune in with us. And I also want to thank Brother Kevion Rogers, who's one of our usual presenters for everything he's done for us. He didn't have a presentation tonight, but he will be back for the next two. Uh, Tonight we're talking about the slumber years of the Southern jurisdiction, brother Paul.
Pretty much.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Well, I'm gonna let you have the floor tonight. It's gonna be pretty short and sweet. And you have a disclaimer you want to state first, brother Paul?
Yes. The first thing, if all of a sudden everything goes black, it's because we lost power, and just I'll be on as long as the lights stay on. Hopefully the whole time.
And I know you want to speak about you're strictly coming out the book right here, and it's just a
right.
strong.
I'm using what I believe is the best, well, one of the best books on the Scottish Rite. That's Ray Baker Harris, James D. Carter, History of Supreme Council, 33rd. And I'm a great fan of that book, and everything, pretty much most everything that comes tonight is from that book.
Gotcha. Okay, well, I mean, everybody know who you are. We've been through the introduction of the speaker. I mean, it's nothing. I'm gonna turn over to you, brother Pa.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
What I'd like to start by saying is that what I'm going to be talking about tonight is, for a good part, a lot of evaluation of things that have been published a number of years ago. And looking at it from a standpoint, we'll be talking about the slumber years of the Scottish Rite in the United States, or most of the high-grade bodies of Scottish Rite in the United States. And that's generally a period of time from, give or take, from the mid-1820s until the mid-1840s about. And this would involve mainly Supreme Council Southern Jurisdiction in Charleston, Supreme Council Northern Jurisdiction in New York, and a Osorno Supreme Council also in New York. The one I'll be focusing on mostly is the Grand Commander of the Supreme Council Southern Jurisdiction of Charleston Supreme Council, which is Moses Holbrook, because everything this period of time, he was Grand Commander from 1826 to 1844 when he died. And so most of what we'll be talking about covers his communications. And he, prior to his becoming Grand Commander, when he was Lieutenant Grand Commander, he struck up a friendship with the Lieutenant Grand Commander of the Northern Jurisdiction, and that was JJJ Gorgas, and that was John James Joseph Gorgas. And they communicated quite a bit through this period of time, and most of it had to do with business that they had, but it was a lot of friendship that was included in this. And what I'd like to do is start off by going into several of the documents that were early on. And this is written by Ray Baker Harris, and it's the apparent loss of the Delco ritual manuscripts was a severe handicap to the brethren in Charleston. Dr. Holbrook frequently expressed his resentment towards Dr. de la Mata for having sold them from his father's papers. Now, what this is talking about, Dr. de la Mata was Jacob de la Mata. That was the son of Emmanuel de la Mata. And if you remember in our last lecture on Grand Constitutions, Emmanuel de la Mata was one of the founders of the Charleston Supreme Council, and he traveled to New York, and that's where he discovered Joseph Osorno, and he founded the Supreme Council Northern Jurisdiction out of a grand consistory that had been established there. Well, Jacob de la Mata moved to New York, and he, in 1814, he received a 33rd degree. Now, at that time, when you received a 33rd degree, that meant you were an active member of the Supreme Council. He remained an active member of the northern jurisdiction. Emmanuel de la Mata died in 1821. Now, when he died, there was a interesting situation. The Charleston Supreme Council had lost a good bit of rituals from John Micheal, who was their first Grand Commander. When he died in 1816, a lot of the material was there was given away by his widow. She didn't realize what it was, and then said that there were several fires that caused a problem. So Charleston Supreme Council was having a problem with rituals. Apparently, Jacob de la Mata, for reasons that have never really been explained, he took the ritual collection, the Southern Jurisdiction ritual collection, and sold them. And that caused quite a stink in the Southern Charleston Supreme Council. And apparently, according to Ray Baker Harris, he freely expressed his resentment. If we look at the next slide here, this was a letter from Moses Holbrook to Gorgas in 1826. And Ray Baker Harris says, Dr. Holbrook wrote to Gorgas of de la Mata. I believe that he would do better anywhere else than here. And this is also from the History of the Supreme Council, 33rd. Now, what he's talking about, when de Mata sold these rituals, patching together information, he was upset that anyone was angry with, he didn't realize something, but he ended up resigning from the Supreme Council Northern jurisdiction. And sometimes they say resigning, sometimes they say withdrawing. And he moved Georgia and then eventually in Charleston. Now, during the time that he was in Charleston, Moses Holbrook was clearly not a fan of his because of his sale of these rituals. So we start off with this area, this going on, that de la Mata was not exactly friendly, or they didn't feel friendly towards him by this early Charleston Council. Now, we have another letter here. This was in a letter to Holbrook on September 5th. This is Ray Baker Harris talking about, he didn't actually publish this letter, he's talking about it. This is in a letter to Holbrook on September 15th, 1827, referring to the Southern Jurisdiction tableau, that's their list of officers. Gorgas said, but as the place of Inspector Lieutenant Grand Commander is vacant and important, would it not be best to make someone appear to be holding it? Then Harris goes on, apparently, therefore, nearly a year after assuming the office of Grand Commander, Dr. Holbrook had not yet appointed Lieutenant Grand Commander. When required, Dr. James Moultrie, the Secretary General, had assumed the position of acting Lieutenant Grand Commander. Now that's interesting because when we look at the time prior to Moses Holbrook, the Southern Jurisdiction was having problems. With John Micheal, that was their first Grand Commander, he was just starting off the Supreme Council. They had an enormous amount of Grand Lodge problems that they were trying to deal with. He died in 1816. When he died, the Lieutenant Grand Commander, which was Frederick Delco, took over, and he began trying to build up the Supreme Council. And he ran into the trouble with the Supreme Council. They were at war. And one of the problems we have in history is when we try to judge history backwards. And a classic example of that is the Supreme Council Southern Jurisdiction today is a very large organization. And across the United States, they have valleys and bodies and number of them. They are well organized. This was not the case in the early 1800s. And if we look at history and we try to say, well, the Scottish Rite and we look at today and we judge a situation back then, we'll come up with a completely different scenario than we should. And we have to understand that they were not in great shape. Frederick Delco, apparently he did not like the fighting that was taking place. And during his administration, his own Grand Lodge was taken over by Cerno Masons. So that didn't make for a good relationship, working relationship with everyone in South Carolina. He eventually, at some point in 1822, it's debated when, he resigned, or he just withdrew, or some reason he left office, and Isaac Auld took over as Grand Commander. Like Delco, Auld didn't really want to be involved. It was too much of a problem for a lot of this. So what he did, he appointed Moses Holbrook as his Lieutenant Grand Commander, and he pretty much was a figurehead. He would do the Supreme Council, but all the business work he turned over to Holbrook. So when Holbrook took over, the decline of this slumber period had already begun prior to his starting, and he was used to things not happening. And it's never been revealed why he did not appoint a Lieutenant Grand Commander immediately when he became Grand Commander himself. But he did not have a Lieutenant Grand Commander at this time. And if you look, this is a copy from the Grand Constitution itself, and it clearly states if the former of these officers die, resign, or remove from the place, that's the area, and they're talking about the Grand Commander, without the intention of returning, the latter shall succeed to his office, that's the Lieutenant Grand Commander, and shall therefore appoint another Grand Inspector to fill his own place thus vacated. So the Grand Constitutions clearly said that they should have a Lieutenant Grand Commander, and at that time they did not have election of officers, which came much later. Now, this next slide was from March 1828, and they're talking about a document that was signed by the officers of the Charleston Supreme Council, and it says the document is signed by Grand Commander Holbrook, M.C. Levy as Treasurer General, Horatio Street as Deputy Treasurer General, Alexander McDonald as Grand Master of Ceremonies and Lieutenant Grand Commander, James Moultrie as Secretary General, and John Roche as Captain of the Lifeguards. It would appear that from this, that Holbrook had appointed Alexander McDonald as Lieutenant Grand Commander. That's the opinion of either Ray Baker Harris or James D. Carter. And it shows that he is Grand Master of Ceremonies and Lieutenant Grand Commander. So what I tried to do was just take that at face value and not draw any conclusion from it. But then we go to the following year and we see a list of officers: Moses Holbrook, Grand Commander; Alexander McDonald, Acting Lieutenant Grand Commander. Now, this was from a patent on 1829. Acting Lieutenant Grand Commander is not the Lieutenant Grand Commander. If he had been appointed as Lieutenant Grand Commander, then he would have signed as Lieutenant Grand Commander, not Acting Lieutenant Grand Commander. We go on to a list of officers in 1830, and number 6 is Alexander McDonald, and it gives basic information about him. Now, this is on 209 of the Ray Baker Harris history, and his office is Grand Master of Ceremonies. Then in the remarks, Acting Lieutenant Grand Commander Pro Tem. Pro Tem means that he's filling a slot. He's holding a spot, a space on a temporary basis. Whenever they needed a Lieutenant Grand Commander, he would fill in. Now, this is 4 years after Holbrook had become Grand Commander. And there's never been an explanation why he did not just go ahead and say, okay, Alexander McDonald, you've been acting as Lieutenant Grand, I'm appointing you. But there's no record that he did that, and there's record that he appointed others as acting. Now, this is a letter and from Holbrook to Gorgas on February 20th, 1832. In our Supreme Council, we have transacted no business of any special importance for more than a year. If we had done anything, I should have deemed it an important duty to have given you early information of the same. So this was 1832 now, and they're not conducting any business. They've gone into this slumber period where there was very little being done. And from this, the only thing I can see is if he had appointed a lieutenant grand commander, as Gorgas had advised him to do much earlier, he would have said, hey, I appointed so-and-so as lieutenant grand commander, but this didn't appear to have happened. Now, this is an interesting letter. This, again, is not the actual letter, but it's Ray Baker Harris talking about a letter that Gorgas had written to Holbrook on June 5th, 1832. Gorgas at the time was the lieutenant grand commander of the northern jurisdiction. And he's talking about the resignation of Samson Simpson, who was the grand commander. Ray Baker Harris writes, Gorgas, who automatically became grand commander upon Simpson's resignation, indicated it was his intention to wait a while until work could resume on a more satisfactory basis. He retained the office of Grand Commander, and the Northern Supreme Council continued to exist. For the next decade, no new members were made and little was done. This is the Northern jurisdiction going into their slumber period, where they ceased to be an active body. And this was, what's also interesting is that they talk about this, he was automatically became grand commander. Now, Simpson had resigned his office. If he had died, it would have been the same thing. And if a grand commander was actually at his house and he was eating his dinner and he had a heart attack and died, well, the lieutenant grand commander, maybe he was sitting at his house, his dinner, and in between bites of roast beef or whatever, he was grand commander before he even realized that the grand commander had died, because this was automatic. The lieutenant grand commander automatically became grand commander when the grand commander left office for whatever reason. And if they didn't have a lieutenant grand commander, that presents a problem. Now, this was Ray Baker Harris talking about the period between 1830s and 1840s. It appears that sometime during this period, Dr. Jacob D. LaMotta, formerly an active member of the Northern Supreme Council, who withdrew in 1826, affiliated with the Southern Supreme Council, and that time before leaving Charleston, Dr. Holbrook had appointed Dr. D. LaMotta to be Lieutenant Grand Commander. Now, that's an interesting theory, and I'd like to know why they believe that D. LaMotta was appointed Lieutenant Grand Commander, and the reason being is the resentment that was said to have been held by Holbrook towards D. LaMotta, and the fact that Alexander McDonald had been acting the part of Lieutenant Grand Commander for a good many years now, at least over 10 years, depending on when they're talking about. And I don't know if it meant that Alexander McDonald did something to offend Holbrook, or if Holbrook and D. LaMotta had made up, but it's an interesting that they would say that he became a member of the Southern jurisdiction and became the Lieutenant Grand Commander. Now, this is on page 214 of the Ray Baker Harris Carter history. Page 221, there's a different account. This was the same year that Holbrook died. There is no record of any actions which Dr. Holbrook may have taken as Grand Commander prior to his leaving Charleston. As already noted, in addition to Dr. Holbrook, the council consisted of 3 others, Horatio Street, Alexander McDonald, and Joseph McCosh. With both Holbrook and McCosh at considerable distance from Charleston, only 2 remained in the city. What about De La Mata? Just prior, they said that De La Mata affiliated and became an active member, became lieutenant grand commander. I find it interesting that that's not mentioned or no mention of it. And then later, a few pages later, there is a possibility, but unsupported by any evidence, that Dr. Jacob De La Mata had been admitted by affiliation to the Southern Supreme Council before Dr. Holbrook departed in April of 1843. He was a member and signed himself as Lieutenant Grand Commander at the first meeting of the Supreme Council after Dr. Holbrook's death, a meeting held on April 15th, 1844. Well, that begs the question, when did Holbrook die? And I did some checking, and I found a number of different dates. In Charles Lobinger's The Supreme Council, this is a very respected book. Charles Lobinger was a very respected historian. He published his book in 1831. He says that Holbrook died on December 1st, 1844. Now, Ray Baker Harris and James D. Carter's history, at the beginning of the chapter for Moses Holbrook, which is on page 169, they say that his term of office went from October 1826 to October 1844. Now, I don't know if that means that his term of office ended when he died, or if they had some information that was not published that he resigned or left office in October, or if this was just a typographical error. But a few pages later, it says that he died September 1844. I tend to believe that this was a typographical error that they made. And it's interesting that he has September 1844 because that disagrees with Charles Lobinger. Now, later publication, 1997, William Fox says that it was December 1st. Now, I remember Brother Fox, he was a son of he was Fox Jr. His father was the grand historian prior to him. I tend to believe that he got this December 1st date from Charles Lobinger's book, and that he just used that date because that's what Lobinger said. But because of the conflict of dates of when Holbrook died, I decided to go to some non-Masonic sources. And I went to this Genie website, which is a genealogical research site, and I went to find a grave website. Now, what they do is they go to different cemeteries all over, and they photograph the graves in the cemetery, and they take the information. Both of these sites said the same date, September 11th, 1844. I tend to believe that. I tend to believe that as it goes along with what Ray Baker Harris said about when he died, Holbrook. But then we have to go, and this is a copy from the Harris Carter book, that December 15th meeting of the Supreme Council. And this is an account of the meeting of Supreme Council at Charleston on December 15th, comes from the following notice printed in Freemason's Monthly Magazine in February 1st, 1845. Sure enough, it says that this meeting was held on the 15th of December, 1844. Then it goes on to say that this was signed by the Lieutenant Grand Commander and our Secretary General. And sure enough, there's Jacob De La Mata, Lieutenant Grand Commander. And then Ray Baker Harris says something, this part down here I think is very important. It says, here it is important to recall that the Grand Constitutions of 1706, the Delahaye copy, the French and Latin versions alike, make no provision for the election of officers of a Supreme Council. If a Grand Commander died, resigned, or removed from the jurisdiction permanently, the Lieutenant Grand Commander automatically assumed the higher office and appointed others to the second place. The Grand Commander appointed all officers. Well, that presents me with two problems right off the bat. The first problem is, if this is true, why did Jacob De La Mata become Lieutenant Grand Commander if Holbrook disliked him? But the even more important problem as soon as, if Jacob de la Mata was the lieutenant grand commander, then in September or October or even December 1st, Jacob de la Mata was the grand commander. And why would he sign this document in February? We have here, well, December 15th meeting and this notice in February. Why would he sign it as lieutenant grand commander? He was the grand commander at that time. The moment Holbrook died, Jacob de la Mata would have become the grand commander. Then we go to the next. This is the chapter on administration of Alexander McDonald. Says there's no evidence that Jacob de la Mata again presided or took any other official action as grand commander after the Supreme Council meeting on December 15, 1844. And again, the only record that exists of this meeting is in this Masonic publication out of Boston. Sometime he had presumably appointed Alexander McDonald as Lieutenant Grand Commander and Albert Mackey as Grand Secretary General. As late as 1855, the bylaws of the Supreme Council made no provision for the election of officers. Albert Pike was the first Grand Commander elected by the Supreme Council, and this was 1859. 1855, the Concord Act with the Supreme Council of Louisiana, and from all appearances, it looks like the Southern jurisdiction of the Charleston Supreme Council says, hey, you guys here elect officers. That's a good idea. Why don't we start that? Albert Pike was elected. The problem that exists is that there is a disconnect, or there is a desired goal that's presented by writers when they have something of interest for them in a particular outcome. I am certainly not going to say that I know what happened or I can prove what happened. But at the same time, I have to sit back and look at the entire situation. And it appears to be that the Supreme Council, Southern jurisdiction, did not actually appoint, Moses Holbrook did not actually appoint someone for unknown reason. He did not appoint a Lieutenant Grand Commander. Why? I can't answer. But we know that for at least 10 years, he was Grand Commander for 18 years, at least years, he had not done so. And there's no evidence he actually did appoint someone. Jacob de la Mata filled as Lieutenant Grand Commander and then had no other known administration duties with the Southern jurisdiction, and then dying within weeks after signing this document or reportedly signing this document, makes me wonder, did that really happen, or is that another Frederick the Great scenario? So the bottom line is that I can't say exactly what happened, but as I want to be an independent historian and objectively look at a situation, then I can't live in a glass house and throw stones at other people, because that puts me in danger of the same thing coming back. And I see that the Southern jurisdiction may have had some problems that they didn't want to deal with in the 1800s when they were in a delicate situation. They did not have rituals or much of rituals. They did not have much in the way of organization. There were times when they went down to 2 or 3 active members. So they, at that time, were not the organization that they are today. So you say, well, they had concerns and maybe they felt that they could bend the truth a little bit. It's possible. But the bottom line is the Scottish Rite is, it's something that to me is a philosophy that is far greater than any individual or any group of individuals. And I've told this story before. When I first joined the Scottish Rite, it was truly like I was coming home. I understood what was going on in the degrees. I understood the philosophy, and I just wanted more and more of this philosophy. And when I began seeing the trouble and in the mid 1800s and the fighting, the infighting, and one brother calling up another brother names that were wholly unmasonic, it tore me apart inside, and I had to step back and try to reevaluate what it means to be a Scottish Rite Mason. And what I believe is, while we can't judge history backwards, we have to go forward. And I believe that the best thing and best way to go forward is to focus purely on the philosophy and teachings of the Scottish Rite. And if mistakes were made in the past, I'm not the one to judge someone from who's been gone long, long before my grandparents were ever born. I have to look at things today and see that we have an opportunity today to do things that we may not have an opportunity to do later on. And with that, I hope that we can grow, and I hope that we can move forward and realize that if we practice the Scottish Rite, we ought to be understood as being Scottish Rite Masons. And that's where I have no definitive answers. I don't have information in front of me that can prove that this or that happened. All I can say is that more study has to be done, and we have to place our values more towards the Scottish Rite individuals. And I appreciate any questions.
Brother Paul, I just want to say thank you for that presentation. Before we get into our questions, I do have something I want to say. This platform right here is for the celebration of Scottish Rite Masonry. We are not here to tear down any other organization. These videos should not be used for any evidence to prove who's regular or irregular or anything. This is strictly educational purposes, and we're telling the story of Scottish Rite Masonry and showing how all these supreme councils, it ties in with one another. So I'll be seeing a lot of arguing and all that, and I just want people to understand that this is strictly for educational purposes and celebration of Scottish Rite Masonry. Do you agree, Brother Paul?
I absolutely agree. I was uninvited to a talk a few years ago, and I've told this story before, and it was because a group of Grand Lodge officers got together and decided that they felt that if my giving a historic talk on the 16th district of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana, and that meant that I would be coming there and turning all of them into Scottish Rite craft masons without their willingness or knowledge. So nothing that I'm doing, I speak for myself. This is purely my voice, based on my research. I mean nothing against anyone. I'm just trying to look at a situation and try to understand it and explain it as best as possible. That's all.
Yeah, thank you. Because I feel like I see a lot of bickering going on, and that wasn't the intention behind this platform. Most powerful has provided us with this platform to strictly tell the story of the Supreme Council of Louisiana, the northern, the southern jurisdiction Supreme Council, and we just trying to tell the story of Scottish Rite Masonry, in the forgotten or even untold story, just of how Scottish Rite just basically spread across America. And I want to say thank you, Brother Paul, and thank you, Brother Rogers, for what y'all do. But now we can move. We got that out the way. We can move to our question. Do anybody have a question?
I have one if no other brothers in line.
You got the floor, bro.
Brother Coker, Pride of Bar 131 out of Florida under Brother Collins, up under the Supreme Council of Italy, a new brother to the lodge and joined here even listening in with another new brother. I had former Masonic affiliations and he didn't. And as we came in, it was much like Brother Poll, and we even watched some of his videos to understand more about Scottish Rite as we decided that this was the next part of our light and our path. So for me, my lodges are all of them that I've ever been affiliated with are still tattooed, by name only. in places where I can still hold them near and dear to my heart because there's something that made me along the way. So even their names, mean something to me to the point where, it's changed my life. But here in Scottish Rite, I guess my only question is, for the first 3 degrees, we saw not only the semblance and the realness of, for one, how they correspond to other things we've even seen in our research before we found light, but how do they correspond even now to what we find, different from other Masons? I believe that all of us have a heart and a mind to follow light, and whatever light we chose to follow, it makes us a better man. But specifically to the light we've chosen, for the first 3 craft degrees of the Scottish Rite, for those first 3 symbolic degrees, how do they play in, and what is their importance in preserving this history that we're preserving even now as we're helping explain this history? The history made sense, but for the first 3 degrees that we have so far, how do they play in to the history that we're preserving?
The first 3 degrees, obviously I can't go into ritual or anything like that, but from a historical standpoint, there is no evidence that the Supreme Council at Charleston ever worked in the craft degrees of the Scottish Rite, and that goes to what was happening in South Carolina during that time. There was the United States Grand Lodge community had decided that they had a policy that they wanted to follow, which was one Grand Lodge, one ritual, one language, English. And this policy in South Carolina was a problem because they had 2 Grand Lodges, and one was ancient and the other styled moderns. And both of them were felt to be completely regular, but there was 2. And the Grand Lodge community wanted 1. So right in the middle of this is when the Supreme Council Southern Jurisdiction was created. And the idea of a 3rd Masonic body with controlling craft lodges there was no way that was going to happen. And so it came into Louisiana. Louisiana actually, this slumber period that I talked about was with those 3 Supreme Councils. Actually, the only body of high-grade Scottish Rite Masonry that existed and continued to exist through this slumber period was the Grand Consistory of Louisiana. And the Grand Consistory goes back to 1811. And the first Scottish Rite Craft Lodge came out of Kingston, Jamaica, the Supreme Council of Kingston, Jamaica, which was Degrassi's 2nd Supreme Council. So Louisiana had an early Scottish Rite presence. The Grand Consistory was actually created a year before the Grand Lodge. So we had a situation where the French community in New Orleans was very tolerant of the individuals, and their feeling was that if someone worked a legitimate ritual, and by legitimate ritual they meant legitimate somewhere, mainly in Europe or wherever, then it was fine. And if they wanted to work in this language, that language, they ended up working in 5 different languages. And the Grand Lodge had no problem with this because they were trying to be inclusive of as many different people as possible. So Louisiana was always different in that regard. But outside Louisiana, there was this 1 Grand Lodge, 1 ritual idea. And so the Craft Lodge in the United States, the Scottish Rite Craft Lodges, is for the most part was unknown to, when I started all going around and visiting lodges and talking about the Scottish, this is 25 years ago, no one had the slightest idea what I was talking about when I'd say Scottish Rite Craft Lodge. And they say, well, what? I've never heard of something like that. And outside the United States, it's one of the most popular rituals worked by regular lodges, regular Grand Lodges, and Supreme Councils. It's understood to be regular, and the fact is there's a continuation between the Scottish Rite Craft Lodge and the 4th degree, 5th degree, and onward. So there's a continuation where it's not disjointed. And there's I may have told this already. There's an old saying in the Valley of New Orleans years ago. If you were a 16th district, brand new 32nd, they say, what's the difference between a 16th district 32nd and the sovereign grand commander? And the difference is the 16th district 32nd has 32 Scottish Rite degrees. The Grand Commander only has 30 because his craft lodge was York Rite in the southern. So there's a connection, but
we felt the connection so far, and that definitely shed some light into that connection. I feel love, like I said today. We feel love from Masons we've known in life and Masons that we've gotten to know since exploring the Scottish Rite. So the love is shared on all ends by brothers that prove themselves true to be Masons. So tonight we are elated to be able just to be here present and to learn. But thank you for answering that question, sir.
Thank you.
I have a question if I can.
Sure.
Brother Whitfield, Epsilon.
How you doing?
I'm well, brother. Did the Supreme Council of Charleston have a working consistory and Rose Cross chapters and Kadash councils? But I don't hear too much about that.
The Supreme Council at Charleston in the very early days was limited to Charleston. And most everything that it had was in the city of Charleston. They had bodies. They had Princes of Jerusalem, and they had several bodies, but they were limited to the Charleston area. After Albert Pike took over as Grand Commander, he expanded that all over. But the early days, this is what I meant by we can't judge history backwards, because in the very early days, they were a small group of men trying to do something. And I honestly believe that what they were doing, they saw value in that old order of the Royal Secret System. And they knew the organization of that was falling apart and it wasn't sound. And they were trying every way they could to create and preserve the teachings that were in these degrees, and that's why they included them in this new 33-degree system. But it was hard. They had to start off from scratch, from nothing. And I believe they made mistakes. We're human. They made mistakes in the early days, and those mistakes were compounded. And I believe it's the Scottish Rite Wars in those mid-1800s. That was one of the most unfortunate things, and it was contrary to everything that the Scottish Rite stands for. And they couldn't relinquish anything, neither side, and they couldn't acknowledge that maybe they could be a little bit wrong about something. And I believe that those early days were very damaging to everything. And the Scottish Rite bodies that they did have under their jurisdiction, they were going up and down and dissolving and being recreated. And there's a number of cases. Holbrook was head of one of them prior to his becoming Grand Commander. But when the Cyrano Masons took over the Grand Lodge of South Carolina, they were crushing them down. So there was unnecessary battles that didn't help the Scottish Rite. So the answer is yes, but off and on, if that helps.
Okay, well, sure, thank you. One last question. So would you agree that if it wasn't for Ladderbot tutoring Pike and making him what he was, that the Southern jurisdiction of Charleston wouldn't be what it is today?
Albert Pike, without question, created the new Southern jurisdiction. No matter if you like the man or don't like the man, you have to give credit where it's due. And he turned a very small organization into something that was very big. I have a number of letters that were written between Albert Pike and Latabé, and they're unfortunate. Like so many people who do wonderful things, Albert Pike was not lacking ego, and he could not stand to be corrected. And Lotta Bay corrected him on a number of cases. There was 33rd degree patents that came in, and they had French and Latin on it, and he corrected the grammar. And he didn't know who wrote it. He says this grammar is completely wrong. Well, it turns out Pike wrote it, and so Pike exploded, and they had a big exchange. And Lotta Bay played a major part in the education of Albert Pike, because when he came to New Orleans, he had received degrees from Mackey, and it was basically, they were communicated, and what that meant was basically, okay, you're a 32nd, and that was as far as that's all he knew. So yeah, Claude Samory, Charles Lafond de Lotta Bay, a lot of those early New Orleans Masons taught Pike and gave him the instruction that he needed, and then Pike ran with it. So that's, yes, I'd say Lotta Bay was a major part in the making of Albert Pike. I believe that it was the New Orleans contention that came to the Supreme Council Charleston session. The half of the Supreme Council of Louisiana members that went to Charleston, I believe they lifted up Albert Pike and brought him and said, you got to take this guy, because if you don't take this guy, you're going to lose big. And I believe they listened to him. And there's a lot, maybe this is for another talk, but there's a lot of, when this elected of offices came, there was a big internal problem within the Charleston Supreme Council.
Yeah, the history runs deep. And I think, Supreme Council of Louisiana, we're the foundation, or at least our blood runs through, everybody here.
All right, this is Brother Collins, Pride of Brevard 131. I do actually have a question. How you doing, Brother Poll?
Good, how are you?
I'm well. I have a question actually two ways. One was, the first question I heard something about, because I was in and out about a slumber with the southern jurisdiction as well as the northern. I didn't know if you could reiterate, so to speak.
All three Supreme Councils at that time, northern jurisdiction, southern jurisdiction, and Cerno, fell dormant. And the word that you use can vary. Some say they became inactive, some say they slumbered, some say they died. It was the wars that were taking place, but it was also the anti-Masonic activity, the William Morgan affair, and the anti-Masonic activity that was taking place in New York, that was spreading across most all the United States. Ironically, except Louisiana, it had no effect in Louisiana, but it was destroying Masonry everywhere. And the three councils, from everything you can see, they simply, you fight for so long, and then you get tired of fighting, and then you just kind of, and that's what I believe happened to Moses Holbrook. He just stopped fighting, he didn't bother appointing the lieutenant grand commander. It was the same thing in northern jurisdiction. They fell asleep, and they ceased being active. Cerno bodies ceased being active. Everyone just seemed to finally say, I don't need this. I don't want to fight anymore. I want to stop all of this. Stop being active. And it was a shame, but all three of them ceased. And like I said, the only body that continued to be active of high grade is the Grand Consistory of Louisiana. And from the minutes of the Grand Consistory, we can find a lot of information where they were due. Grand Consistory, we passed, they passed under the Charleston Supreme Council. They went, well, at first they were under Cerno. He ceased to be active. And they wrote to Charleston, and they passed into Charleston. They ceased to be active. And I see in the minutes book, there's a period of time where they ceased being the Grand Consistory of Louisiana, and they became the Sovereign Grand Consistory of Louisiana. And it's often wondered if during that period of time, if they themselves became a Supreme Council. And the way you would tell that is if they created a 33rd by any 33rds, and we don't have enough information to answer that question. So we don't know. We know that they changed their name for a period of time, and they were under no jurisdiction. And then they have finally passed under this when 1839, when Supreme Council of Louisiana was created. A year or two later, they passed under their jurisdiction. I believe that it was a delay because they wanted to see if they would hang around a while, and they didn't want to keep passing under somebody and then they'll die off. But there was a lot of trouble and a lot of problems that created this slumber period, and that, if that answers you.
Yes, sir. Thank you. My second question actually is, I guess, concerning the Cerno Supreme Council. I guess what happened with it, and was it considered regular?
You know, it was a Grand Secretary, I can't recall his name right now, of the United Grand Lodge of England, said regularity is subjective, recognition is factual. And it depends on who you talk about recognizing Cerno Masonry. Cerno Masonry had, in the very early days, it became very popular. And today, if you look in the Mackey Encyclopedia or any of the encyclopedias, they have Cerno's name, the man's name, is now used to define irregularity. And yet at that time, Louisiana, for example, we passed under Cerno, we made friends with them simply because their Lieutenant Grand Commander was the sitting Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of New York. And so a lot of people said, well, wait a second, if we know the Grand Lodge of New York is regular, if their Grand Master is his Lieutenant Grand Commander, maybe we better take another look at them. Maybe they're not so irregular. And so, and there's a long story about this, but Cerno Masonry, the Supreme Council of France considered them regular. The Grand Orient of France considered them regular. Now, the Grand Orient at that time was, well, they would not only recognize, but recognition from them was highly desired. So it's hard to say regularity because it varies and it depends on the time, and you know, it changes. So yes, they fell apart just like the others, and they were not considered regular by the Charleston Supreme Council or the Northern jurisdiction, but others did consider them regular. So it depends on the time. You can't go backwards and judge.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Are there any other questions? We got Brother Rogers just joined us. You there, Kevion?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, okay. There was a question about the Cerno Supreme Council. Did Brother Paul gave his answer on it. One of them, the guests asked, "Were they what are your view on the Cerno Supreme Council as far as them being regular?" Can you hear me?
Okay. Oh, so you're asking me. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I actually was just joining in because, we're still having like weather out here in Birmingham, but it's real, like, in my view, when you look at like the Cerno Sovereign Grand Sanctuary Consistory for prior to Saint Laurent, all right, like I said, he didn't start mentioning him being like the 33rd and all that stuff until after his communication with Jermaine Hackett. All right, so, but prior to that, he actually was basically working the 25-degree system, and his argument was simply that the constitutions and all that stuff were fraudulent, and that just because you have this new system doesn't mean you have supremacy over the old system, which I could see, how that argument will work. All right. So, but when you go forward with that again with that Elias Hicks group, you know, because Cerno had already left by the time Saint Laurent had got here, and then made that Supreme Council into like a, you know, I guess a proper Supreme Council. So technically, even when you make those two transitions, like I don't really consider, I think it's really a misnomer to claim Cerno Supreme Council and like how we would think of it, if that makes sense, you know? And then but when I said when you look forward into it, like I said, post Saint Laurent, you know, that's Supreme Council of France, Supreme Council Mexico lineage, you know, with the Latin constitutions. So, you know, that's when I will argue when that New York body had like a quote unquote proper Supreme Council besides the Germain Hackett communication, you know. So you know, so like I said, I'm not like that New York story, like I had, you know, studied it maybe about 12 years ago or something like that, but that wasn't like my current you know, my current focus. My current focus actually was the Sovereign Grand Council of Scotland, in that history with Walker Arnault, because I know in 1904 they actually sent a charter to Joseph Cheri for all of their degrees that were happening over there. So, for instance, well, my interest was actually SEL's OES. The Scotland had received OES from Robert Morrison when he was on his way to Holy Land in 1860, and that charter was actually held by the Scottish Grand Council of Rights, and it was from them that originally Cheri and them actually got their OES charter. And then I think later on, you know, the SEL was in league with some of the John G. Jones bodies, but prior to that, they actually had their lineage through mainstream jurisdiction for their OES. And then because it was considered a body beyond the craft, or, you know, degrees beyond the craft. And it was the same thing with the charter. There's a guy named Timothy Roberts. He had died in, I think, maybe 2018 or so of a stroke. But he,
yeah, I remember him well.
Yeah, but he actually sent me a copy of the charter with the seals, and actually has Robert Jameson's signature on it. And Robert Jameson, he was the Grand Secretary of the early Grand Council of Rights, and, you know, the Scottish Grand Council of Rights. And on that signature is where they sent over the Mizraim patent to the SEL. So, like, I think that's still in y'all archives, you know, saying, because he sent me pictures of it back in 2015, like January 2015. Because I was originally looking at JQA fellows, because we actually had a charter on the Grand Consistory side, and I found it when we were moving locations, you know. So, and I wanted to compare our 1864 charter with the 1904 charter of Joseph Cheri and Jameson, you know. So, you know, so like I said, it's a very interesting history about, you know, how that Scottish connection and that Melrose connection had to play with the degrees beyond the craft and beyond the ancient set of Scottish Rite that the SCL had. And I think after the McBlain charges, they kind of suppressed the other bodies except the OES, you know. So,
You mean,
so that was like,
you make Blaine Thompson?
Yeah.
Yeah, they got all his stuff George Lawn collection at Tulane.
Okay. Yeah. So like I said, like Thompson and Jameson, you know, like I said, the Grand College of Rights in Scotland, they actually had forwarded all of their degree systems to the SEL. So like technically, you know, the Rite of Namur was in that system, Memphis Rite, Mizraim, OES, the early Grand Royal Arch charters, the Knights Templar Royal Arch priests charters. Like it's like I think they had like about 8 different bodies under their jurisdiction at one time. But it was like, it was just very interesting. Like I haven't had a chance to actually get all the documents together to actually put a presentation. Just because of COVID, not everybody's working in those libraries and archives, and that's the reason why I had to like step out of actually trying to present something. So.
Well, we sure appreciate you, Brother Roger, for stepping in and adding your flavor to it. As always, I want to say thank you to our most powerful sovereign grand commander, illustrious brother Eddie Gabriel Sr., for providing us with this platform to even, be able to even do this in I'm sorry, I had to read the bottom. To even, provide us with this platform to even distribute out this information. Once again, we want to say thank you to everyone for tuning in. Like I said, there's other things you could have been doing, and we're looking forward to next one. We should be doing the next one maybe within the next week or two, and we'll provide that information here soon. Are there any remarks you want to have, Brother Paul or Brother Rogers?
I'm hearing the storm blowing up out there. I'm surprised I've stayed on long. But we'll see what happened. I'm getting a flash. It says your internet is unstable. So
okay. What about you, Brother Roger? You got any remarks you want?
Like I said, I was able to come in late because I'm on call, so because of the storm and stuff. But I will definitely review the video after it's submitted, and then so I can try to put my little 2 cents on it afterwards. But appreciate all the brothers who are able to like come on and support these presentations about Louisiana Masonic history and the SEL, because it's a very, very interesting and intriguing system of masonry. And it's just like just like I was researching the Lodge Melrose in Glasgow, that all the way up to like 1872, Lodge Melrose and Kilwinning, they actually had daughter lodges that weren't even part of the Grand Lodge system. So it's just like the more you like start researching this stuff, it really opens up your mind into like what is masonry and like what is it about and stuff, and it's just not, it's more like a family, or like kind of like how churches have multiple denominations, it's the same thing. And so like I said, I just very much appreciate this journey. All right, peace. Bye.
I do have a final question. I'm sorry to chime in late again, Brother Collins, Pride of Brevard. But no, my final question is this: that was originally my second question. Well, actually, I guess I had 3. But no, would that make the Supreme Council of Louisiana the oldest practicing Scottish Rite body in the United States? Is what my other question was. The fact that everything else ceased to exist and they continue would be mine.
The Grand Consistory of Louisiana is the oldest continuing operating body of high-grade Scottish Rite Masonry in North or South America. Supreme Council of Louisiana, that's debatable because there's still debate as to if the Northern, you see, there's because of the Lieutenant Grand Command system situation with the Charleston, there's a debate there. There seems to be less debate with the northern jurisdictions that their Grand Commander continued throughout, but it's not clear. So it's kind of like it's obscure, and at some point you have to say, is it that important? Is it important to be the oldest? Is it important to be the best or number one? Or is it just important to be the Scottish Rite? That's what I think the real question should be.
Hey, man, we do this every time, but he did get his question in. That's what. Where's the question at? Brother Long asked, could you clarify the issues with Folger, Atwood, and Full House had with the northern jurisdiction and the southern jurisdiction?
Sure, if you got about 3 days. Yeah, it's extraordinarily complex. We talked about it some in the first lecture, and maybe we can talk about it a little more.
Yeah,
But
we'll work on that.
it's a very complex situation, and it's far too much for a Q&A session.
Gotcha, gotcha. Well, I guess we're gonna end it here. I know y'all having some technical difficulties down there because of the storm, and I guess that might be our next video. James Fullhouse or Eugene Chesnack. We'll go that direction to make, but probably possibly build, up to the issues or whatever that they want clarity on. But I do want to take, like I said, I do appreciate everyone for coming in. We'll see you next time.
Peace and blessings.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Travel well, my brothers.